Today, I'll be ranking the premium assets in the midfield category, arguably the most important category in FPL, and thus the one you really want to make sure that you get right. I've got unique insights to help rank them and differentiate between the best and the worst. And without anything else needing to be said, let's get into it. Right, we have Martin Odegaard in 8th place, and for me, he's comfortably the worst asset out of all of the ones we're about to look at. The one particular issue I have with him is how the fixtures don't really align with his strengths. I will, however, start with the positives, and that being Wolves at home. Wolves are very likely to go to the Emirates and set up in a low block. This means he'll have ample opportunities to run the game, and also he'll have ample opportunities to operate in those small spaces, which is in close proximity to the box, and thus leverage his skill set, which is operating in those small spaces, given he's such a technical player, right? And that's good for him, all right? So we get off to a great start. But from there, it becomes significantly more difficult. We have Villa away, Brighton at home, and Tottenham away. All games, specifically Villa and Tottenham, which are going to require large distance transitions. They're going to require Arsenal going from back to front very quickly, given the managerial philosophies and styles of Villa and Tottenham. So with that in mind, does he really fit into that? Well, no, because he is a player who, again, operates in small spaces. All you had to do is watch them on transition last year at Arsenal, and it was not him being the ball carrier, and thus it wasn't really him arriving either at the end of Arsenal's moves. And that's why I worry that for these games, it could be very difficult for him to have a real impact. I think where his impact will be off the ball, given he's so good at pressing, especially in the opposition's final third, and he could help Arsenal in that way. But in terms of running the game, I think it's far more difficult to do against Villa and Spurs, right? And they'll probably be run from a distance further back by the likes of maybe Jorginho or Rice, or depending on Arsenal's defensive structure. But even to get on the end of moves, I think it's more going to be the likes of Saka, Havertz, Martinelli, who really cause the damage in these type of games. My second point is one which Arsenal assets had a problem with last year, and that's their spread of output. And sometimes in FPL, a blessing can also be a curse. We've got so many good assets, right? We've got Saka, we've got Havertz, we've got Martinelli or Trossard off the left, we've got Odegaard as an 8, and dependent on who the other 8 is, we could potentially see returns from them. And there's usually such a wide range of ways that Arsenal score, including their set pieces, right? They're so good at that. And because we know that they're a defense-first side, when they are up 2-3-0, they don't necessarily always have to go for the kill. They can just sit in and control the game to an extent. So with that in mind, you never are really too sure of where the goals are going to come from. And the best way to figure it out is essentially to work backwards. Is to look at the fixtures first and which players they stylistically align with. For example, Villa, Brighton, Tottenham, that's more of a front three, or specifically Arsenal's front three, that could thrive in those type of fixtures. Whereas Odegaard would probably be better against the likes of Wolves, Everton, Ipswich, etc. So with all of that in mind, on top of the fact that there are other assets who are cheaper with better fixtures, there are other assets who are at a similar price range or more expensive with significantly better fixtures and are far more reliable in terms of output. For me, it just doesn't make too much sense to go here unless you're really looking for an early game week 1 payout. His expected minutes are very good if you were looking to hold long term, but aside from that, I would avoid him for now. Now, we have Kevin De Bruyne in 7th, and I was actually a little bit hesitant to put him at 7th because I envisage a scenario where he could genuinely do really, really well. And let's discuss why. So he's got good fixtures. I don't think anyone can really argue with that. Their run's nice, and especially for the best team in the world, it's difficult for them to have a really bad run anyway because of how good they are. But there's a couple of things this season which weren't necessarily present last season in terms of a few variables, which I think could bode well for De Bruyne. So one, do his expected minutes improve? Now, if you look at last year, he wasn't really an option purely because of this. But without City recruiting anyone who plays in those central positions as of now, given the fact that Belgium got knocked out early in the Euros, given the fact that he's had time off, given the fact that he hasn't had a long-term injury in quite a while, does he now become a bit of a better option in terms of expected minutes? So that's something to think about. The second thing to consider is the fact that Pep Guardiola is unarguably one of the greatest managers of all time. And one of the reasons for that is because he's so good at iterating his sides. Yes, he has an overall footballing philosophy, and if you look at all of the sides he's coached, they will align with that footballing philosophy. However, he does make small tweaks. For example, once upon a time, he was fixated on the idea of Cancelo as an inverted fullback and that being the way forward. However, specifically through the games against Liverpool, he came to the understanding that that probably wasn't the optimal approach. Thus, he opted for 4 centre-backs and had Nathan Ake in that left-back role to essentially lock down any of the opposition's wide threat. It worked wonders. Last year, they did very well. They won the Premier League in a very difficult race, but they didn't win the Champions League, and they could have been a bit better overall. Haaland could have scored more goals, and that's something we're going to touch on at a later point. With that in mind, he will most certainly be looking to get better. And one of the things that I would say wasn't particularly good about City last year was the lack of service into Haaland. Really, he should probably be scoring more goals in that particular side. One way to solve that is by giving De Bruyne, I guess, a little bit more responsibility again and taking some away from Foden, in the sense that City didn't have too many passes in those central areas. You look at the goals Foden scored, and they're primarily because of ball striking as opposed to intricate moves, which allowed him to arrive in those positions. Thus, could he have a slight reversion in his philosophy and allow De Bruyne to become a bit more of a passer again? And thus, we see the De Bruyne-Haaland relationship flourish even more. And these are just things to consider with expected minutes in mind and the fact that they could improve. And maybe, just maybe, he gets a bit more responsibility and onus over that entire midfield, specifically that number 10 spot on the pitch. I think he could do a bit better. And for me, if I had to be bullish on one slightly underrated asset, I know I have him at 7th. That's mainly because the others are so good. It would probably be him. The other thing is, we can't write him off. I think one thing I've seen with the content preseason thus far is that people aren't really speaking about him in the correct light. He is undoubtedly the best 10 that the league has ever seen. And I think we have to respect that. And if he is fit, he is, at 9.5, a very, very dangerous asset to have. 9.5 is probably a little bit cheap for him as well. I probably would have made him 10, because even with bad expected minutes at some point in the season, he's going to prove very effective when we know he's going to get a couple starts in a row. But yeah, definitely someone to consider, and I would just like you to give a little bit more thought to a player like him. Similar to Kevin De Bruyne, but to an even greater extent last season, this is a heavily disrespected number 10. This man is a top player, and it is very difficult to argue otherwise. And thus at 8.5, even though, again, he's 6, he certainly provides you an opportunity to acquire a premium-like asset at a non-premium price. Let's look at the fixtures firstly, and I actually quite like them. Fulham have lost arguably their best player in Palhinha, and one who is integral to their defensive structure. Okay, so with that in mind, a very logical conclusion would be that defensively, they're going to be weaker. Even with their recruitment, it's very difficult to replace Palhinha pound for pound. So you can assume, at least defensively, a little bit weaker. Southampton away, one of the better fixtures on the calendar. Liverpool at home, we're going to speak about them specifically tomorrow in a video that I'm really, really happy with, which you'll watch tomorrow. But I don't think they'll be as good as last year. And they're a side that's always going to offer you a little bit, even under Slot. They'll still offer you a little bit in terms of transitions and attacking opportunities within the game. Brighton's slightly more difficult because obviously they've got a new manager. But player pool largely the same. And given it's a very top-down run structure at the club, I think you can't expect too much of a shift in at least footballing philosophy. Yes, De Zerbi is an extremist, right? So it won't be as attacking and it won't be to the same beat, but still there'll be attacking principles at play. So the fixtures are quite good. Then the other thing to note is Man United can't really get worse than last season. They came 8th, and they've got Euro, they've got Zerke, they're looking to get Ugarte, which will likely happen. So they have strengthened to some extent. Now, what extent you can debate, but they have strengthened, and that isn't really one that's up for debate. Okay, with their improvements at centre-back, with returning players from injury, Martinez, Shaw, he should be able to stay higher up the pitch because they will dominate areas on the pitch more. They will have more of the ball. Now, with that in mind, the idea of dominating space on the pitch, having more of the ball, we go to probably an even more important position, and that is the number 6. Now, Casemiro's legs were starting to go, so whilst he was an aggressive jeweler, he couldn't cover the space that someone like Ugarte can, simply for the fact that he's a lot younger. And with all of these variables in mind, if he's able to stay higher up the pitch because they have more of the ball, because they can dominate more space, because they have better athletes, well, he's going to be in closer proximity to goal. There's going to be a higher volume of attacking actions. And with his quality, it's a very logical conclusion to make with the variables discussed previously that his returns will increase. And I think that's something to really note because he, at 8.5 million, as I discussed earlier, has the potential to haul week on week on week on week because of the type of player he is, because of the quality he has. And these are just things that I think are probably going a little bit under the radar and they're only being looked at a real surface level. He's also the one that has the best expected minutes and penalties. And there aren't too many assets in the game which have penalties, brilliant expected minutes, or a midfielder, are not too expensive, and they're a captain of a top 6 side. So these are all things to consider. And I would at least play around with having him in a draft or two and just seeing how you feel about it. For me, this is a top 3 right winger in the world, and there's no real debate over that. Saka, Salah, and Lamine Yamal. With that in mind, and the fact he's a quality player with a different skill set to Martin Odegaard, the fixtures for me, I view in a different light compared to his Arsenal captain. For me, Villa away, Brighton at home, Tottenham away, no problem. Even Wolves at home, with his wider variety of skills, I'm very happy to hold Saka throughout all of them. There are a couple things which I don't like about him. We'll start with the positives. The fundamentals in terms of FPL assets and what you're going to look at initially are brilliant. You've got penalties, you've got set pieces, you've got threat from open play, you've got goal threat, you've got assist threat through a variety of sources, right? He can cross, he's comfortable in small spaces, transitions and crosses, etc., right? So he ticks pretty much every box. There are just a few concerns I have with him. I told you that I was comfortable with him in the fixtures, and I am. It's just the fact that if you look at it from an opportunity cost standpoint, there are other assets with just better fixtures. So yes, he's very competent and capable of performing against the likes of Villa and Spurs, right? Two very, very good sides. But is it not just better for me to pick a player who plays a worse side and not have to deal with the quality of Villa or Spurs? So that's something to think about. The second thing is, again, the spread of output and the fact that he's a winger, right? So whereas Odegaard at least is always going to be in those central spaces in closer proximity to goal, Saka is not. So that's something else to consider. And the third one is 10 million to Saka. When you have that spread of output, knowing that Kai Havertz is at 8, knowing that 3-4-3 is a very feasible and viable formation, especially with how the current landscape of FPL is looking, Kai Havertz is 2 million cheaper. And he's certainly someone who's capable, as we saw towards the end of last season, of generating a lot of output within this Arsenal side. And I imagine it's only going to be more fine-tuned to essentially platform this £65 million asset even better. So with that in mind, is Saka really the best usage of 10 million? Is he the most efficient use of 10 million? And I just wonder if potentially he's a little bit overpriced by at least 0.5. So that's just something to consider. A top asset, but it's the price that's really putting me off going down that route, essentially, because of who he blocks. I'm going to talk about blockers more tomorrow. In isolation, brilliant, but at his price, with the other options, such as Havertz, I would at least consider potentially going another way. I say this because he's got a very high ownership at the moment, and I haven't built a single draft with him in it yet, apart from my no Haaland one, I'm not really likely to go. So I've got Son at 4th, and one of the reasons I have him at 4th as opposed to having Saka here, and it was a very tight call, is simply because Saka's coming back later from the Euros, and thus I'm not sure what his fitness is going to be like for Game Week 1, although Arteta would probably play him if he only had one leg. I really like his opening fixture, and I like the fact that from the little that we've seen pre-season, there is a decent chance that potentially starts at 9 again if Postecoglou is happy to let someone else play at left wing, as opposed to having Son there and Richarlison at 9. He spoke about his fondness for that, but maybe shifting his philosophy. Maybe he wants Brennan Johnson there, who's had a decent preseason, as an example. And the fixtures after that, well, they're not too bad. And similar to Saka, he's somewhat fixture-proof, right? He can score against pretty much anyone, given the standard of his finishing. And at 10 million, I know I'm getting penalties, brilliant expected minutes, and essentially all of the fundamentals. He is the talisman. He has a high ceiling, and really what I'm really clinging on to here is the elite finishing, and that providing a good floor. Even when he doesn't play well, he doesn't have to, whereas Saka probably has to play pretty well or have quite a good moment to manufacture a goal from himself, considering the wide right areas he starts from, whereas Son in those central areas, and even if he is on the left, naturally he's just going to drift in, considering his tendencies, will always be there to at least notch one return. And I think for a premium asset, you don't really want to be fluctuating between low and really high returns, more so middling returns, and then obviously approaching the upper echelons of the ceiling. So that's why, for me, I feel very safe with Son. He's an asset that has rewarded managers fantastically well for a number of years now because of this variable, because you know that there is a sense of reliability with him. For me, that's the only reason I have him at 4th, pretty much, the reliability. I'm not super bullish on him. However, I do expect an improvement in Spurs from what we saw to the back end of last season, given their recruitment. And it's essentially, if he can keep up with that development as he ages, it will be something to look out for in pre-season. I'm not sure it's right to gamble on him from game week 1 when you have other options, and it's the next 3 that I really like. But if you are to, I would say you look at game week 1, you hopefully get lucky there, and then you are willing to at least reassess from. He's similar to Son in the sense that there's one redeeming quality of him as an asset, which or maybe 2, which I really, really like, which have got him up to 3rd. And the 2 things are his ball striking at a wide variety of angles is brilliant, and thus he's always capable of scoring goals. And the second and third is the fixtures in combination with how good of a side City are. The fact that they are such a good side is what makes fixtures so exploitable, and pretty much any of them. So those are the things which I think he has going for him, and they're big things, right? Hence why he finds himself third. There are a couple things which I wanted to speak about, and things that have already been spoken about, just not specifically regarding to him. One is the shift in Pep's philosophy. Does he introduce a more of a passer as the number 10, which Foden is not compared to De Bruyne? Does he give De Bruyne more responsibility? Because as we discussed, he is the great iterator of all time. The second thing is, can he maintain his standard? I'd say, in my opinion, and the statistics do back this up from some very, very impressive graphics that I've seen on Twitter and some very, very impressive pieces of analysis, in the sense that he's not a player who was performing at his level. He was overperforming to an extent in terms of his output. And thus, I wonder if we see a slight regression to the mean in terms of where he should really be performing. And obviously, he won the Premier League Player of the Season last year. If he's not allowed the same license and freedom and responsibility, in particular, in that number 10 role, do the perceptions of his performance from the public start to change, and does that start to filter into his mind? I know it's a very niche point, but they are footballers, they are human, and it's certainly something to consider. So for now, I have him at third because I don't want to make too many strong assumptions, but these are all assumptions that at least I'm going to think about and have in the back of my mind when deciding to select an asset like Phil Foden. But again, we cannot ignore what he did last year. We cannot ignore the strengths, which I discussed, which are big strengths. And that's at 9.5, given he's a little bit cheaper than some of the other premiums. With good expected minutes to start the season at least, I'm still confident he'll do relatively well. One of the main reasons being how good Manchester City are. Now, you may be very surprised to find this man second as opposed to first. And you know what? So am I. Because when I was making the graphics, I had it very much in my mind that Salah was going to be first, and I had to sort the rest of the order. But it was the first time, because I had to do some actual analysis on Salah, that I started to think about the pros and cons. And we're going to go into this in a deep, deep dive tomorrow. And that's what tomorrow's video is. And I'm really, really looking forward to posting that for you guys. And hopefully you guys enjoy it. But when I started to think about it, I realized at surface level, yeah, sure, probably the best asset. But when you go deeper, there are some variables which haven't had any consideration that I've seen from content thus far, which need to be. One is Arne Slot's style and system. Well, his wingers aren't really what Salah used to do for Jurgen Klopp. He used to penetrate those half spaces repeatedly, run beyond the last line, and really infiltrate the defense. And thus, he was able to rack up and score many, many goals. But a slot winger is slightly different. And we're going to go into this in more detail tomorrow. But it's not the same. And it doesn't have the same impact on the game in terms of goals. So that's something to consider. The other thing is, well, we're replacing Jurgen Klopp. This is a really special manager. Are Liverpool able to maintain the same standard? Considering their recruitment hasn't been, what we'll say, world-class thus far in the transfer window. And these are all things we're going to go into real depth tomorrow. Naturally, he is the greatest right winger the Premier League has ever seen. Naturally, he has penalties. Naturally, the expected minutes are brilliant. And he has a promoted side on the opening day, okay? And the fixtures in general for the medium term are very good. And that's why he finds himself at second. There are a lot of good variables at play. But today and tomorrow, in more depth, I'm going to analyze the counter arguments to Salah and why potentially he's not as good of an asset as maybe you think. And these are all things I would suggest to think about before coming into tomorrow's video. But naturally, like we said, the greatest right winger the Premier League has ever seen. And thus, he will always be an option that is at least around. One thing to consider is last year, he didn't quite hit the heights. Naturally, he had injuries and AFCON, which we would have expected, and neither did Haaland. So it goes to show that these premium assets, and the best of them, they're not impenetrable, and they can have slightly off seasons, and changes to their environment and external conditions can result in a decline. And all of that meant that Cole Palmer found himself at number 1. Again, I really didn't expect him to have him here, but his performances at the Euros were so good, and when I was making the graphic, again, it got me to thinking, well, if he's that competent in an England side that didn't look great, if he's willing to take that level of responsibility, if he's now got a season under him, which was brilliant, and the confidence to go along with it, and Chelsea have strengthened, and I prefer the managerial style, slightly more for Chelsea this year, at least slightly, well, then he's surely set for another brilliant season. He has a huge amount of influence on this Chelsea side in terms of creativity, final third actions, volume of actions, whereby the opportunities for him to return will be so frequent. He has all the fundamentals, similar to an asset like Saka, but he's probably allowed to come a bit more inside, and he's probably allowed to start in slightly more central areas than Saka is. And at 10.5, 2 million cheaper than Salah. Is he potentially an alternative? Yes, he potentially is. The fixtures are very good as well after Manchester City. And I think these are all things that are worth consideration. Sure, Nkunku's 4 million cheaper, and I really like Nkunku at 6.5, but he won't have penalties. And also, we're yet to see exactly how he's going to function in this type of system and where his fitness is at and how Chelsea manage that. I think he'll be fine, but something to note. So is there potential for the double up? Did Chelsea just start really strongly? And we have two assets in the midfield with really high ceilings and high floors, because that's what you get with Palmer and Nkunku. So for me, Palmer now is comfortably one of the best assets in the game. And if I don't own him, I'm not going to enjoy it. So I'm going to have to find a way to potentially get him in. I wasn't really open to the idea until I went through this video and started to realize that, you know what, maybe now he is the next big thing. And he is going to be an asset like Son, like Salah, like Haaland, who's going to dominate for years to come. Particularly ideal, but nonetheless, it gave me a little bit of a break, which I think was a little bit needed. So yeah, please do consider subscribing. Like the video if you enjoyed. And like I said, tomorrow's video will be a very special one. It's one I'm really, really looking forward to publishing and had a great time essentially constructing. And it will be no Salah, okay? And you will see. And the other thing of note is that Fantasy Football Hub currently have 50% off and money back if you win your mini league. My co-star there is showcasing the AI tool, which has been hugely helpful to others and myself in building our teams. And if you really consider it, in today's market, it's a very cheap price for membership, right? You get a lot. You get a lot. Customized statistics tables, customized fixture tables. You can sort by a variety of different variables. The AI tool, team reveals from some of the best, team reveals from the world champion. And the product is just getting better and better and better. It's becoming so simple to use as well. So I would really consider checking it out because you clearly care about fantasy and, you know, winning is always a great feeling. So with that in mind, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much, and I shall see you tomorrow. Consider subscribing. Goodbye.